and I'm on the OACE board. And we are going to record this presentation. Okay. Oh, Adrian, you already did that. I was getting down there. All right, thank you. And so if Mike would like to share his screen and start the presentation, it is 11:15. This goes from 11:15 to 12:15. Mike, do you want to say a few words? Anything else? Introduce yourself. Mike Johnson from DRC. I'm not sure. We lost Mike.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
There he is.
Sorry, I was just getting the PowerPoint switched out from the other one I had up there mistakenly. But I'll let John Weiss, if he wanted to have an introduction quick. I don't know if John's on mute or not. Or
he's unmuted. John, are you there? I remember John when we started with TABE 11, 12, and all the TABEs coming out. How you doing, John?
I'm good. How are you guys doing? Good morning.
Awesome. Anything you'd like to say, John? Start us off for this presentation with TABE CLAS-E.
Sure. First of all, we had a great vendor session this morning, and you know, we're real excited to continue and expand our partnership with Aspire by including TABE CLAS-E. And I'm real happy to have Mike Johnson join us as well. Mike's the national account manager for TABE. I'm sure most of you guys know Mike, and Mike's going to talk about TABE CLAS-E online. He's probably going to talk a little bit about the pilot that I know a lot of you guys who are attending this session were part of. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Mike.
Okay, thank you, John. And everybody should see the CLAS-E screen up here. So we're going to talk a little bit about TABE CLAS-E online and just go through the pieces of that as we move forward. And you should see the screen change. Hopefully, if everything's working correctly, the slides are changing to the overview. And just as a recap of what TABE CLAS-E is, I just have a couple of quick overview slides to talk about the content of TABE CLAS-E. TABE CLAS-E is the ESL assessment for adult English language learners. And there are 4 content areas within CLAS-E. There's the reading content area that allows low literacy students to use picture-based items to start out with, but then going up to longer reading passages. There's also a listening portion, and listening is a little bit unique that they actually do listen to a listening passage. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. And then writing is a 2-part assessment where there's a selected response or multiple choice section first, and then a constructed response or actual writing responses as a second part. If writing is done, both sections need to be completed to get a writing score. So just as a reminder for that. And also the constructed response pieces are scored locally by your program using the rubrics that are provided by DRC. So they're not sent back for scoring, they're scored locally, and the scores are captured within the online testing system. So we'll review that a little bit as we go forward. And then lastly, the speaking section. If speaking is delivered, speaking is also scored locally with a rubric. It is moved forward with prompts for the student. They do record their speaking passage, and we'll look at an example of that as we get into the details a little bit more today. But each of the 4 content areas, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, are all individually administered and can be individually administered. I believe in Ohio, most programs do reading and listening, but again, the other areas are available. They all do generate their own NRS scores. Getting into the online portion of CLAS-E, the times are a little bit different for TABE CLAS-E online than they are for the paper and pencil. We do allow a little bit of extra time for the writing portion because the candidates are typing. We also do allow a little bit of extra time because there's some unscored questions on the test, just like there are with TABE and the high school equivalency test. The unscored questions allow us to gather data on new test questions going forward. And that's the area that we will talk about as the field testing. TABE CLAS-E is under review, and the review that we're working on is to go ahead and develop a new assessment to the new NRS guidelines. So many of you are aware that TABE 9 and 10 changed into TABE 11 and 12, and that was due to the new NRS system from the U.S. Department of Education. There's also changes from the Department of Education related to ESL standards, and those are being implemented now. We have completed an alignment to the new standards with TABE CLAS-E's current objectives, and they align very well. What we want to update is the questions within the test. So what we're covering from an objective standpoint aligns to the new NRS system. What we want to do is update some items that may be out of date or not performing as expected on the test. So we have some unscored questions. As John mentioned, we just finished a field test that had been going on through the beginning part of 2020. And we will be now applying for federal approval for a new version of CLAS-E later in 2021 under the federal guidelines. The only thing that will change with the new version is the forms. So very similar to how we went from 910 to 1112, we're going from forms A and B to forms C and D in TABE CLAS-E. So you won't see a big change related to the questions, just a few questions being replaced, but the objectives will still stay the same as we go under the new federal guidelines. Switching over to the online side of CLAS-E versus paper and pencil, TABE CLAS-E Online does go through our Insight testing portal, and it is the same portal that's used for TABE Online. So if you're using TABE Online, you'll be very familiar with TABE CLAS-E Online. You can access the administrative side of the portal from any browser. As long as you can get to the internet, you can log into your own account. Once you do log in, you'll have access to different menu options, whether you're working with limited permissions or you have full permissions. So most programs will offer full permissions, and you'll be able to register students, you'll be able to set up test sessions, and we'll run quickly through some of those areas. We won't go too in depth, but we can certainly do that at a later point if local programs need that. When we go into the Insight system, there are sections for general information that have our announcements that we post. We also post our documents that can be there. These are all the manuals. You'll notice at the very top of the list is our CLAS-E, or as our full TABE user guide for the whole system. But then a little bit farther down, the third one down is our CLAS-E test administration manual. So in the paper and pencil world, things that would have been booklets or manuals now are PDF files in the online system, and you have access to download all these files that you might need. You can also set up, we'll touch on in-person testing and remote testing, but the in-person testing allows you to have it on any type of computer in the testing room or testing lab. You can have it for Windows or Mac or Linux or Chromebook, and we have all the installing information on our downloads tab. Typically, this is just your IT person going to this, so you're not going to those downloads on a regular basis. And this is only related to in-person testing. When we go back into our system, if you're not familiar with the TABE Online system, you do set up users. Users in the system are related to anybody that is working with the test, essentially anybody that's not a person taking a test. You could be a teacher, a counselor, an administrator. In the TABE CLAS-E Online system, you're a user related to that. So users get set up in the system. They have different permissions. You can add single users at one time if you have a new staff person come on board, or you can upload all your users at one time. So they're very efficient in getting the users added to the system. And then at the bottom of the screen, every individual person that's a user has their own permissions. So permissions can be very general because we have sets of permissions that can be assigned, or you can be very specific and give one individual person rights into the system. So that's also applicable for TABE Online and CLAS-E Online. Permissions can be updated at any time. And again, I'm going to go through this online portion pretty quick and get into the CLAS-E portion. So certainly if you have any questions, you can always put them in the chat feature, or we'll have time at the end to take questions as well. Within the TABE CLAS-E Online system, programs are either districts or schools. And I will give an example that Kent State in the TABE Online world is the district administrator for the state of Ohio, and then all the sites within that are using TABE Online are considered schools. We don't use the teacher role too often. Some large community colleges sometimes use teacher roles, but not too often in the TABE world. Everybody has permissions, as you can see. Permissions are different for every role. The district and the school role are very similar in permission. It's just the hierarchy level that you see the permissions are at. So again, using Ohio as an example, the folks at Kent State that manage the TABE Online account have access to the whole state, where if you're at one school, you have access to your school's data. So it's just the hierarchy that's related to permissions. And anytime we have new users come in, we can always update their record and change their record. So you can always edit new users into the system. Once we have our users set up in the system, we'll set up our students in the system. And we do that through student management. And student management will be able to find new students or add new students and upload them into the system. Very similar to the way that we added users. The one difference is that we have some required information for students, and that required information is first name, last name, date of birth, and gender. We ask that you be as specific as possible when you're adding students into the database. So for example, my name's Mike Johnson, or is it Michael Johnson? You know, what way am I going to be in the Aspire database should be the same name that I'm in the TABE CLAS-E Online database. You'll notice there's an accommodations tab, so you can grant accommodations. For CLAS-E, the time accommodations are 1 1/4, 1 1/2, or 2 times. And then you also have untimed testing and text to speech. This is the location that you would grant the accommodation after it's been approved. The same process that you have used for accommodations in paper and pencil is the same state process. This is just simply where you allow that accommodation once it has been approved. Students also have the ability to change their background color in the testing. Those are not accommodations, those are modifications. So students have the ability within the testing application to update their interface if they choose to, much like you would have a color overlay or an individual having large print in a paper and pencil world. Those are not necessarily accommodations, they're more modifications for that. If you do happen to put a placeholder date of birth, we see a lot of people that put January 1st of 2000 for the date of birth. You can always come back and edit that student's data. So there are some programs that don't collect date of birth initially, but it's an identifier in the CLAS-E Online system. So we want to make sure that we do have accurate data. So if we do need to compare 2 Mike Johnsons, or in this case, 2 Bill Kahns, we want to make sure we have some separation with the date of birth for that. After a student has been with your program for a while, and they may have many tests that they have been scheduled for, in the middle column, you'll see a status column, and it will tell you, is that student not yet started? Are they happen to be in progress, or have they completed certain tests? So you're always able to check the status of a student's progress depending on what tests you have registered them for. One of the main parts of the CLAS-E Online system is the test management system, and setting up test sessions and adding students to test sessions and printing test tickets. This section, test management, is the area that is more the day-to-day area that you would go into for CLAS-E Online. Within test management, we will set up different test sessions based on our needs. So we may have locator tests, we may have pre-tests, we may have post-tests, and we can set up those different test sessions based on our need. Oops, sorry. So here's an example of a test session that's in the middle of being set up. Up at the very top, we've called this test session CLAS-E Test 1. And then our role is to complete the boxes and mark the check boxes on what test we want to provide. And so we'll notice here that we check in the middle box reading, and then on the far right-hand box, we're setting up CLAS-E reading at level 2A. This is a test session that we're going to create and store in our system for a period of time, and that date range at the bottom of the screen is the second half of 2020, so June through December. So what this means is that now we've created a test. Anybody that needs to take a 2A reading test between June and December, we have that created already. So test sessions are very similar to scenarios. You set them up in advance and enroll students into those scenarios as you take enrollments in. You may have better names for test sessions. So here's a better name of a test session. It's very similar to what we saw before, but the session name in the top left corner is more explainable. It says CLAS-E Reading 2A, and that's different than what we saw previously. It just said test number 1. So I encourage everybody as they create test sessions to have the best detail for the session name. This might even be a better name if I said CLAS-E Reading 2A June through December 2020. In that case, you would see that this is a very specific session. At the very bottom of the screen, you'll notice that we have a couple of students that are eligible or available to go into this session, and then one student that is added to this session already. Every test session that you create will have at least one student in it, but you may have other students that you can add into it, and you can use the Find button to add new students into the test session, or you can create a new student right within the test session with the New Student button. So here we have a different test session. Just to give you an example, we have CLAS-E Reading and Listening levels 2A for August, and August is kind of cut off on the session name in the top left corner, but I've selected the parameters of that test session being reading and listening, levels 2A for both of them, and I have some students that are entered into this session. So again, when we're using CLAS-E, much like you do with TABE Online, you'll create test sessions as scenarios or possible scenarios, and then you'll add students into those scenarios. You can add a student directly into your test session using the Add Student button, and it looks exactly like it did under Student Management. So we can add that student directly into our test session, and it will create the record in our database. After you have sessions created, they'll be added to your session review list. And you'll notice again, we have a status column in the middle of the blue bar. And we have some sessions that are started or completed and some sessions that are not started, just depending on if those students have started taking the tests. So the second one that's listed, CLAS-E Test 1, it has completed its testing. And the first one, the students have not yet started in that test. When you do have the test session detail, we have all the icons on the outside of the right-hand side that allow us to have different action pieces. The one that we use most often is the pencil icon to go into that session and add new students. But we can also export our details out. We can copy that session. So if we saw that test session for August and we wanted to make one just for September, we can do that very quickly by copying the parameters. And then the next two icons allow us to print our test tickets that are needed for students to take a test. The print test tickets can be done with the spreadsheet icon or the printer icon. The spreadsheet allows you to select individual students, and you may have up to 50 students in a test session, but only 5 are testing today. And so I would select those 5 and print their test tickets. The printer icon will print all 50. So just the difference between being able to select them or being able just to print one large PDF with all the test tickets. Test tickets themselves will also have a roster as the first sheet. And so this roster shows 3 students. None of those 3 students have an accommodation assigned to them. And as a roster sheet, we have their username and passwords in case we need them. But the second page is the actual test tickets. The test tickets is another area that's a little bit different between in-person and remote testing. For in-person testing, we would cut these test tickets apart on a sheet of paper and hand them to each individual student. For remote testing, we would cut and paste the credentials and send them to the student through the chat menu of our web conferencing system that we'll talk about later. So again, we don't email credentials out for remote testing. We do that through the chat feature of our web conferencing systems.
Mike, there's a comment in the chat. Everyone in the test session has to take the same test, form and level. Is this correct?
Correct. Whatever the title of that test session was, whatever the parameters you created, that would be the test that they are going to take if you put a student into that test. So I can create as many different sessions as I need, and you can put students in all of those sessions if needed for that specific purpose. A student goes into a session, or if we put 10 students into a session, they're all assigned now to take the test of that session, whatever we created that session for. And I see another question just popped up about the locator. There is a CLAS-E locator that does provide guidance on what levels. For CLAS-E, we use levels based on numbers. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's very similar to TABE where it's EMDNA, but 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest. And the locator would allow us to select the level based on the results of the locator. Once we have an individual test session created, we can start to see again, now the students, these are a list of students that are in a specific test session. And we can see the first person is, the first name is test. They have not started. The second person is help desk, and they have completed their test. The difference is, you'll notice, is that not every student will test at the same time. If I go back a couple slides real quick, and I don't want to go back too often, but our test session was good from March till December on this example that we have. So you might have a couple people in March, you might have a couple people in April, and then in June, they're all going into this same test session because of what the test session was created for. But they will test at different times, and so we can see their status. The one thing nice about this status screen is that it does list the actual time versus just the date. So we can always check the time and say, well, yes, this student completed their test, but they took the test in 2 minutes. So maybe that might contribute to the score that they received on that test. And a question on the locator. The locator is within the online system, so it can be scheduled as a test session for that as well. One thing that might come up in remote testing, and we won't go in too deep on all the remote details, but there is the ability to lock or unlock a session. So we see that there's a padlock next to each student's record. And if we needed to, in a remote scenario, if we see a student doing something that they shouldn't be doing, if we lose a student from an internet connectivity standpoint, we can lock test sessions and lock test tickets so that students can't go into those tests unproctored. And just if you lock a session, you can certainly unlock it as well with the padlock as well. Double check the questions here real quick.
Yes, there's a.
Yeah, so there's a question about the locator. The one difference between CLAS-E and the TABE 11 and 12 locator is right now in TABE 11 and 12, you have the choice of doing an automatic locator or an individual standalone locator. And the automatic locator for CLAS-E is not yet active. It's still in development. So The locator is a separate test session within CLAS-E. It is not charged, so there's no usage fees for using the locator in CLAS-E. But once you deliver the locator, you would look at the locator report and then assign the student to those test levels based on the locator guidance. So switching over to the portal itself, the accessing for the students, the difference is if I'm doing in-person testing, they access the test through the blue DRC icon that's been added to any testing computer at your facility. If they're testing remotely, they access the test by the URL link listed at the bottom. I will caution you that this URL is specific. It needs to have these numbers, this long URL, and I'll do it real quick. I don't want to jump out there too long. I know our time is short today, but if you pay attention to the URL, it ends in these two sets of numbers. If I click on it, it will open up my browser. Should open my browser fairly quickly. There we go. And what it does is it just changes that URL address up at the top. It shortens it to a redirected website. If you are going to cut and paste it, if you're going to bookmark that URL, you have to use the full length URL and set that bookmark manually versus just automatically saving this shortened website. This shortened one will not take you there if you try to use that directly, just as a sidebar for that. Oops, let me go back to our PowerPoint here. When a student does go into the test, whether they go through the blue testing icon or the URL, they're taken into the test window, and they can take our tutorial or they can sign into the test. Once they're going to sign in, they use their test ticket information to sign in with their username and password. And the big difference between paper and pencil testing and computer-based testing is that the students work themselves through the directions. So they're presented a screen that will provide them instruction at the bottom with a scroll bar so they can scroll through the instructions. But there's also a quick check of the computer to make sure it's operating correctly and can continue with the testing. So they're told if they see the 3 circles, they can go ahead and continue. And then they're presented with a menu of tests that they have been scheduled for. This menu might be very short. Maybe it's just reading if that's all the test session was. This specific menu says speaking, listening, reading, and writing. That means my test session contained all 4 tests, and I signed this student up for that specific session. So each student will see what was assigned to them based on the test session that you put them into. So I may have just reading and listening listed here. I may have just reading listed here, depending on what my test sessions were. Once we go into the test a little bit further, if they were assigned the listening, they'll go through a quick check to make sure they can hear and that they can record if they're assigned the speaking. And then they'll have the sample questions. These sample questions will allow them to use the same exact interface. It's just with unscored sample questions. So they can go ahead and go through the different features. We have the highlighter at the top. We have the option eliminator. We have a sticky note. We have the magnifying glass. So all those features can be used. If they, let me go back to the listening. On the listening, you'll notice up at the top of the screen, it has the listening. I took this screenshot while it was playing, but there is a start button for the listening. They have to listen to the listening test. They're not following along with a written passage. It is a true listening test. They listen to that, then they can mark their answer. And on these sample questions, we do provide a review to check their answers. So within the tutorial, you'll see a check your answer section. Same thing with the speaking. If you decide to use the speaking test, they do record their answers. These recordings are saved in the testing platform for you to then go into and review and score locally with the rubrics that are provided. The test directions are spoken to the candidate, so it's going to ask them, I know this question kind of by heart, that it says, what was the amount of the check? And so you would record and you have 3 chances to record your speaking passage if you want to re-record it, but then you can also check your answer during the sample questions. Writing, just as I mentioned, writing is 2 parts, the multiple choice part, but then also a constructed response where they actually type. Programs may choose to do writing still in paper and pencil if students like to do writing with paper and pencil, or if they're okay with typing, they would type their response in here. Again, there is extra time added to accommodate for the time needed for typing for the writing test. At the end of a testing window, whatever that test was, so we see here it was a reading test. Oops, sorry. They are presented a summary that allows them to go through and see the questions that they've answered, any ones that they've skipped. If they flagged a question, they can go back to those questions and review those as well. Question about the speaking test. For writing and speaking, both of those tests are scored locally with the rubrics that we provide, correct? And just to show that, again, the tools when we're in a testing window, we have all of our tools, and I'll go through some samples here real quick. The highlighter, fairly straightforward with the highlighter. We also have the option eliminator if you're teaching test taking strategy. Sometimes this is more applicable to a math test, not necessarily an ESL test, but the tool is there. They can cover up answers. You can also turn on the sticky note and take notes if you prefer. You can magnify the screen. So these are all student-driven tools. The student has access to them. They can change the color of the background if they need to. They can reverse the contrast of the page completely if they need to. And they could even cover up with a mask, masking different sections. So you can see this person masked all the navigation features within the test. So these are all student-driven tools that they have access to. When we use the reports after the test is done, the reports are 2 portions. One is the educator scoring. If I did deliver the speaking or the writing, I would then access those results through educator scoring. And you'll notice a couple of things here is that we have the passage on the right-hand side of the screen saved, and I can listen to this passage. And I also have my rubric scores to mark on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we have the resources that are available for this scoring judge to access. We have the scoring guide, we have the rubric, all of those are PDF files that we can open up and have on the screen or have printed for us while we're scoring this speaking passage. You'll notice one thing that's not on the page is the student's name. So the scoring is anonymous. They are just coded with the coding that you do not have the student's name. So a scoring judge for speaking would log in, they would go to the educator scoring section and see that there are responses there for them to score, and they would go through and score those. They know that it is a 3A test. So they know the level of the test, and they can look at the rubric related to that level. But they don't know the name of the student, so they're not having any bias related to the name of that student. For the individual profile, the information that's provided on the profile sheet above the orange line is the student's name. Below the orange line is where they took the test and what program they were within. And then below the gray shaded line is what content areas they tested on. And you can see that this person tested in both February and March, so different days, and it will track the level and form that they took. It also track the points on the test and the number correct that they had on the test. It will provide the scale score and their NRS level, and then a description of the NRS level in the middle of the page. And at the bottom of the profile sheet, how they did against the objectives on the test. So we can see reading, there were 3 main objective areas: quantitative literacy, read words, and reading comprehension. And this student performed very well on all those areas, and so they're marked at full proficiency. If I'm perform less than, you can see on listening, I'm not so proficient, so I didn't do very well on the listening test, and I have listed it non-proficiency there. Let me just double check real quick. I think a question that came in. So a question about the having a new detailed report. We are building more reports out for CLAS-E, yes. So there will be more information available as we move into the new versions of CLAS-E, as well as now that we're out of the pilot phase for CLAS-E, we'll have new reports added. There's a locator report. There will be a roster report added for CLAS-E as well into the menu. I'm going to jump over before I talk quickly about remote proctoring, because we have a whole session on that. I'm going to jump back to our website. I'm going to go to our public website of tabetest.com. And on our public website under resources, there is down on the near the bottom a link to our online tools training. So if I go down to our online tools training, this is a resource you can use today to access sample questions in the online environment. It does tell you in the second bullet point that you do need to use the Google Chrome browser, but once you have that installed, you can click down at the bottom to start the tutorial. This again is the same tutorial that's within the testing window, but you could do it ahead of time. A lot of programs do this as a group webinar session. They review the testing window with students ahead of time so that they're very comfortable with it. There are tutorials for TABE 11 and 12 and for CLAS-E. I'm going to click on a reading one real quick, and then I'll go into a listening one a little bit as well. So we do have tutorials for standard version or the text to speech with the audio, but I'll do standard. And the tutorial provides you the test ticket information right on the screen. So there are no test tickets to hand out for the tutorial. The username and password are provided right on the top of the screen. So I'll go ahead and type that in and start this reading tutorial. And the first thing that you'll notice is that the student is welcomed in at the top with their name. This is the name that you registered them under, what test session they're taking, and then they can go ahead and click continue. Notice that my menu is just the reading tutorial. So that is what I was scheduled for. It's not reading, listening, and writing. It's just one content area. So I go ahead and click into that, and I, as a student, now work through my test directions. This is another great opportunity if you want to do this in a group setting. It's the same directions that they will see on test day, so you can get them familiar with the testing platform. They can go ahead and click through the directions and begin the test. Again, this was a reading sample test. Up at the very top corner, we see there's 2 sample questions with my drop-down arrow, and we can go ahead and put an answer in there. And if we choose to, we can check our answer at the bottom.
The correct answer is read. There is a word missing on line 1. The word read belongs on line 1.
So we have that information that's there. If I go to the next page and I click another answer, I can check my answer if I want to, or I can just go ahead and go next and go to the end. And you'll see that I'm brought to my review screen, and I can, again, jump back to question 1 if I want to. The green box on the bottom left lets me go back to my review screen. After I'm done, I have the black button at the bottom to end my test. Even when I clicked end test, I still have to confirm again. So having students accidentally exit out of a test is very rare, because they have to confirm twice that they want to exit out of the test. And I'm going to go ahead and exit and go back to our menu. And I'm just going to go quickly into a listening one, just so you see listening. I think reading and listening are the ones that are used most often in Ohio. And I'll type that username and password in there. And the listening, again, we'll go through the directions, we'll get to the menu, and
If you can hear my voice, select the Sound is Working button.
And so now I've confirmed that I can hear, and we can go through the directions, the pre-check of the system. And now
You will begin by doing a sample question. Look at Sample A. In this part of the test, you will listen to people talking. Then, you will answer a question about what you heard. Sample A has 3 answer choices. You will hear the answer choices spoken aloud as you read them. Choose your answer. Listen carefully. You will hear it only once. You will hear someone talk. Then, you will answer a question.
So again, that was the directions. In a paper and pencil world, the proctor is reading those, but now the computer does that.
Sample A.
Can you go to the store and buy 6 apples?
What number did you hear? Mark your answer.
So a couple of things. You'll notice that the line there was continuing. So the student has about 11 seconds after the question is read to answer, mark your answer. And I can go ahead and click the answer. If I wanted to check my answer, I can do that down there.
The correct answer is 6. If that was not the answer you chose, change your answer now.
A couple of things that we'll notice is that there is no drop-down menu in the top left corner. For listening, I have to take it sequentially. I can't jump from question 1 to question 5 and back to a different question. So listening follows the same requirements of the paper and pencil test, that we play the listening passage just once. There's not a way to replay it. And I cannot go back to that question after I've completed it. It's going to do it again here.
In the next part of the listening test, you will hear longer
I'm going to end
conversations.
this so we don't have to sit through a second.
You will hear either
question.
1, 2, or 3 people talking.
So let me go double check our question. So that is correct. On listening, they take the test sequentially. They can't move forward until they at least listen to the passage. They don't have to always respond if they don't want to, but they have to take each question in order on the listening test. And that's unique just to listening. I'm going to jump back to our PowerPoint. And I'm going to skip forward on the remote proctoring. Just to talk about remote proctoring a little bit, is that we do encourage a lot of practice. So practicing with your staff. Everybody is nowadays used to attending Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings, but not everybody's used to leading them and using the tools that are provided. So we encourage that both practicing of the examiners so that they're familiar with the platforms that you're using for WebEx or Zoom, but also that they're familiar with the online testing system for CLAS-E as well. We still only limit 5 students at a time to be proctored, and there's a lot of resources that are provided on our website for remote proctoring. For CLAS-E Online, as well as TABE Online, you have free access to our support system, so you can always contact our support team. As I mentioned earlier, the locator test does not charge or count towards your usage in the CLAS-E Online system. Each individual test counts as a token. So if a student is assigned reading and listening, they would be assigned 2 tokens, and they only are counted once they start each individual test. So even registering students for many different tests does not count against your balance. It's only when they log in and take a specific test. So you could register somebody for reading, listening, speaking, and writing, and they only take the reading test, and they would only use 1 token for that.
Mike, there's a question in the chat about having to use Google Chrome. Is that the only browser?
Remote testing, Google Chrome is the only browser that is supported. If you're doing in-person testing, you're doing it through our blue DRC icon, so you don't have to worry about the browser for that because it's built into that blue icon automatic. So the tutorial and the actual testing for remote are used through Google Chrome. I see the person mentioning Microsoft Edge. It may or may not work with other browsers. It's only certified to work all the functionality with Google Chrome. So again, for the the performance. I know it doesn't work with Firefox, for example. So, you want to make sure for the students' perspective so that they're not having issues with the system to go through Google on that. Jumping back out to our website, just real quick under our resource tab, let me go to resources. We do have some CLAS-E resources listed here. Let me go down. Oops, sorry. Under CLAS-E Online, you can have more information related to CLAS-E. If I go into our testing platform inside the portal, so this is for online testing, if I go under the general information tab that we talked about earlier, there are documents related to CLAS-E that can be helpful. And I'll pull those up here real quick. One of them is near the bottom of the screen, and I'll move it up a little higher, our CLAS-E headphone recommendations. So again, for listening, they use headphones. For speaking, they're using a microphone. So we want to have guidance on what headphones work best with the system. And there's a PDF file for that as well. As I mentioned earlier, the CLAS-E test directions and the online test administration manual are posted there so that you have access to all the documentation that's needed within the portal itself under the general information tab. I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions or any comments. If anybody wants to take themselves off of mute, they certainly are welcome to do that and ask any questions related to CLAS-E.
Hey, Mike, I also added in the chat box as we wind down here that if they have more questions, they can contact you through the exhibitor tab because we're also getting ready for our Zoom lunch meeting, and that the exit ticket for this session can be accessed at the link provided in the chat or under the agenda here for Mike's presentation. There is a sub-session that you can click on and do your exit ticket. Any other questions?
Well, I appreciate everybody's time today, and certainly if you have any questions afterwards, we do have the remote proctoring webinar after lunch, and both John and I will be attending that, so we can certainly answer any additional questions then as well.
Something just popped up in the chat about concerns about specific test items and how do we submit them?
You can submit them right to John or I. So again, my email is mjohnson@datarecognitioncorp.com, or you can send them through the conference information as well.
Yeah, and Lori, I think you have my contact information. I can put it in the chat too. I'm more than happy to take those and submit them into DRC.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Mike Johnson from DRC and John Weiss for all the information. I even got some information, so pass on to my group. So very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.